What does it mean to be free, truly free? Imagine fighting for years to break free from one empire, only to find yourself under the rule of another. This is the untold story of the Philippine-American War, where promises of peace clashed with the cries for independence, and a small island nation dared to challenge a rising world power in the name of freedom. Asterisk, the Philippine-American War began in 1899, shortly after the Spanish-American War had ended. The United States had defeated Spain and acquired the Philippines through the Treaty of Paris. But this ignored the fact that Filipino revolutionaries had already declared independence from Spain and had established a functioning government under Emilio Aguinaldo. The Filipino people had fought hard to end centuries of Spanish colonial rule and expected freedom, not another foreign power. Tensions quickly escalated when American troops refused to recognize Filipino authority and insisted on occupying Manila and other key areas. A skirmish between American and Filipino forces in February 1899 marked the start of the war, with the U.S. labeling it an insurrection rather than acknowledging it as a fight for independence. Initially, the Filipino forces attempted to fight in a traditional manner, lining up armies and engaging in set battles. However, they were outmatched by the superior weapons and logistics of the American military. As a result, Filipino fighters shifted to guerrilla tactics, using the geography of the islands, local support, and surprise attacks to resist the American presence. In response, the U.S. military adopted harsh counterinsurgency measures, including the use of scorched earth tactics, mass arrests, and the establishment of concentration zones for civilians. Especially in regions like Batangas and Samar, American commanders, such as General Jacob Smith, ordered brutal campaigns intended to break Filipino resistance at any cost. Thousands of civilians suffered from famine, disease, and displacement as a result. The war reflected not only a military clash, but also a moral and political struggle over the right to self-determination. While American leaders spoke of bringing civilization and order, many saw this as a thin veil for imperial ambition. The war officially lasted until 1902, though sporadic resistance and unrest continued for years. Filipino resistance during the Philippine-American War was driven by a strong desire for independence after centuries of Spanish colonization. When the United States acquired the Philippines from Spain in 1898, many Filipinos who had already declared independence and established a republic under Emilio Aguinaldo felt betrayed. The initial phase of resistance involved conventional warfare, with Aguinaldo's army organizing into regional units to face American troops in set-piece battles. However, the Filipinos were outgunned and outnumbered, and their traditional tactics failed against the better-equipped U.S. military, facing heavy losses and battlefield defeats. Aguinaldo and his commanders changed their strategy and turned to guerrilla warfare. This shift involved small, mobile units that used the terrain to their advantage, conducting ambushes, sabotage, and hit-and-run attacks. The support of the local population was crucial in this phase, as fighters relied on civilians for supplies, intelligence, and shelter. Villages often served as secret bases, and resistance leaders emerged in different provinces to continue the struggle independently. The decentralized nature of the guerrilla movement made it difficult for American forces to claim a clear victory. In response, U.S. troops intensified their campaign with harsh counterinsurgency tactics, including reprisals against villages suspected of aiding rebels, mass arrests, and the use of reconcentration camps. Despite the increasing brutality of the war, the spirit of resistance persisted. Even after Aguinaldo was captured in 1901, various local leaders like Macario Sakay continued the fight, declaring new republics and refusing to surrender. The resistance was fueled not only by nationalism, but also by anger at foreign occupation, land exploitation, and the loss of autonomy. Though ultimately suppressed, the Filipino resistance became a symbol of courage and determination, laying the foundation for future movements that would eventually lead to full independence decades later. During the Philippine-American War, the United States military employed increasingly brutal tactics in an effort to suppress Filipino resistance, especially after Filipino fighters shifted to guerrilla warfare. The frustration of battling an elusive enemy led American commanders to adopt harsh measures aimed at breaking the will of the population. One of the most infamous tactics was the use of reconcentration zones, where entire villages were forcibly relocated into guarded camps. These camps were overcrowded and unsanitary, resulting in widespread disease and death among civilians. Outside the camps, American troops often practiced a scorched earth policy, destroying homes, crops, and livestock to deprive guerrilla fighters of food and shelter. In provinces like Samar and Batangas, American forces conducted especially harsh campaigns. General Jacob H. Smith issued an infamous order in Samar, instructing troops to turn the island into a howling wilderness, and to kill anyone over the age of 10 suspected of aiding the resistance. Entire towns were burned, and suspected sympathizers were tortured or executed. The use of waterboarding, then called the water cure, became a widely reported method of interrogation during the conflict. These tactics were justified by American commanders as necessary to end the insurgency, but they resulted in massive civilian suffering and drew criticism from both Filipino leaders and some American citizens. Estimates suggest that over 200,000 Filipino civilians died due to war-related causes including famine, disease, and violence. Villages were regularly raided, and even women and children were not spared from the effects of military operations. The brutality of the war highlighted the deep contradictions between the United States' stated mission of benevolent assimilation and the realities of imperial control. While the U.S. government claimed to be bringing civilization and democracy, the methods used revealed a willingness to crush independence movements by any means necessary. The Philippine-American War resulted in devastating casualties and losses on both sides, with the Filipino population bearing the heaviest toll. Estimates suggest that over 200,000 Filipino civilians died as a result of the war. These deaths were not just from combat, but also from famine, disease, forced relocations, and widespread destruction of villages and farmland. The scorched earth tactics employed by U.S. forces, along with the use of reconcentration camps, created conditions where entire communities suffered from hunger, exposure, and illness. In many areas, civilians were caught in the crossfire or suspected of supporting guerrilla fighters, making them targets of brutal reprisals. Filipino combatant losses were also significant. Around 20,000 Filipino soldiers and fighters were killed in action or executed after capture. They faced overwhelming odds in terms of firepower, logistics, and training. Despite these disadvantages, many continued to resist until the very end, often fighting with outdated weapons and limited supplies. Leaders such as General Antonio Luna and Macario Sake were either killed in combat or executed for continuing the resistance. The breakdown of organized Filipino military resistance did not stop localized uprisings, which further contributed to the body count. On the American side, more than 4,000 U.S. soldiers lost their lives, with thousands more wounded or disabled. A large portion of these deaths came not from combat, but from tropical diseases such as malaria, dysentery, and typhoid, which ravaged U.S. camps and outposts. The war also left emotional and psychological scars on many American soldiers, some of whom later spoke out against the tactics they were ordered to carry out. The human cost of the war far outweighed any strategic or political gain, and it left behind a legacy of trauma, resentment, and a long-lasting wound in Philippine-American relations that would take decades to begin to heal. The policy of benevolent assimilation was introduced by U.S. President William McKinley as a way to justify American control over the Philippines following the defeat of Spain. It was presented as a civilizing mission, where the United States claimed it would uplift and educate the Filipino people, bringing progress, democracy, and modern governance. In theory, it was meant to be a peaceful transition from colonial rule to a more enlightened society under American guidance. However, in practice, The policy often masked the harsh realities of military occupation and political domination. While some infrastructure improvements were made, such as the building of roads, schools, and public health systems, they came at the cost of Filipino self-rule and dignity. The U.S. administration disbanded the First Philippine Republic and imposed American-style governance through appointed officials and military governors. American teachers, known as Tamosites, were sent to spread English and Western values. Education was expanded, but it also served as a tool for reshaping Filipino identity under American ideals. Economic reforms favored U.S. investors and landowners, often displacing Filipino farmers and weakening local industries. Land ownership policies were altered in ways that increased inequality and deepened rural poverty, especially in agricultural provinces. Despite the promise of benevolence, the American presence was enforced by the military and sustained by suppressing any form of resistance. Censorship, surveillance, and imprisonment of nationalists continued for years. While some Filipinos cooperated with American rule and even benefited from it, many others viewed the occupation as another form of colonialism. Nationalist sentiment never fully disappeared, and Filipino leaders continued to push for autonomy. The contradictions between the lofty ideals of benevolent assimilation and the reality of foreign control created a deep sense of betrayal among Filipinos, who had fought and hoped for true independence after centuries under Spanish rule. The legacy of the Philippine-American War left a profound and lasting impact on both the Philippines and the United States. For the Filipino people, the war marked a painful interruption of their struggle for independence, transforming their newly declared republic into an occupied territory. Even after the war officially ended in 1902, resistance continued in various forms, especially in the Muslim regions of Mindanao and among nationalist movements that refused to accept foreign rule. The brutality of the war, the loss of life, and the suppression of Filipino self-governance created deep scars that influenced the nation's identity and political consciousness for decades. American colonial rule, which lasted until 1946, introduced systems of education, governance, and economic policy that shaped modern Philippine society. While some infrastructure and institutions were developed, the benefits were unevenly distributed and often served American interests. Filipino culture, language, and traditions were affected by American influence. As English became a dominant language in schools, government, and media. Despite this, Filipino nationalism remained strong. Leaders like Manuel L. Quezon and Sergio Osmegar emerged to advocate for greater autonomy, eventually leading to the establishment of the Commonwealth of the Philippines in 1935, a transitional government that promised future independence. World War II and the Japanese occupation of the Philippines temporarily interrupted this path. But after the war ended, the United States granted full independence to the Philippines on July 4, 1946. However, the relationship between the two countries continued, marked by military agreements, economic ties, and political influence. Legacy of the war lives on in historical memory, commemorated in monuments, literature, and education. For many Filipinos, the war represents both the cost of freedom and the enduring value of national self-determination. It remains a reminder of how deeply a nation can suffer in its pursuit of independence, and how that struggle continues to shape its future. In reflecting on the history of the Philippine-American War, we uncover a story shaped by courage, resistance, sacrifice, and the longing for freedom. What began as a promise of liberation turned into a painful struggle against a new colonizer. The Filipino people, with unwavering determination, stood against overwhelming odds to defend their right to self-rule. Though faced with brutal tactics, immense loss, and a foreign power that claimed to civilize while suppressing their spirit, endured. The legacy of this war is not only one of tragedy, but also of resilience, a reminder that the path to independence is often paved with hardship. As we remember the voices lost and the lessons learned, we are called to honor the enduring strength of those who fought not just for land, but for dignity, identity, and the right to determine their own future.